a fascinating historical story about a place where history sleeps uneasily, a battlefield that witnessed the soul of a nation forged in fire. Here, on these quiet, rolling hills, the very ground is soaked in the blood and sacrifice of a generation. It is a place where the past is not merely a collection of dates and facts, but a living, breathing presence that whispers on the wind and rustles in the leaves of the ancient trees. The air itself seems to hum with the echoes of forgotten voices, the faint, spectral drumbeat of a war that never truly ended. For some, Gettysburg is a monument to the past, a place of solemn remembrance. But for others, it is a place where the veil between worlds is thin, where the ghosts of history walk hand in hand with the living, their stories unfinished, their battles still raging in the twilight of our own time. And on this night, under the haunting, crimson glow of a blood moon, the whispers are about to become shouts. The past is about to awaken, not as a terrifying specter, but as a chorus of lost souls seeking peace they never found. It is a story of where history isn't just remembered, it's relieved. The autumn air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a fragrance that seemed to bind the present to the countless autumns that had come before. Sarah Mitchell breathed it in deeply, a familiar perfume that always settled her soul. She stood on the crest of Cemetery Ridge, her favorite spot in all of Gettysburg National Military Park. She watched as the last vestiges of daylight bled away, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. Below her, the fields where Pickett's charge had reached its bloody crescendo stretched out like a dark, sleeping sea. The monuments, stark and silent sentinels in the fading light, cast long, skeletal shadows that danced and swayed as if with a life of their own. Tonight was special. A rare total lunar eclipse, a blood moon, was set to grace the heavens, and Sarah, in her capacity as one of the park's most passionate historians and guides, was leading a special after-hours tour. It was an event that had sold out in minutes, a testament to the public's enduring fascination with this hallowed ground and the mysteries it held. She adjusted the collar of her jacket, a nervous energy fluttering in her stomach. It wasn't the usual pre-tour jitters, it was something more, a strange, electric hum in the air that seemed to resonate with the very marrow of her bones. Nervous? The voice, laced with a familiar, easygoing humor, startled her. She turned to see Thomas Brennan, or Tommy as everyone called him, grinning at her, his camera slung around his neck like a talisman. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, sparkled with a mischievous light that seemed to defy the encroaching darkness. Just a little, Sarah admitted, her voice a soft murmur. It's not every day you get to see a blood moon over Gettysburg. It feels significant. Tommy's grin widened. Significant is one word for it. I'd go with epic. Or maybe even spooky. He raised his camera and snapped a picture of the darkening sky. The shutters click a sharp, metallic sound in the growing stillness. The light is perfect. Almost otherworldly. Sarah couldn't help but smile. Tommy was a local, a Gettysburg native who had grown up with the ghosts of the battlefield as his imaginary playmates. He was a photographer, and a good one, with a preternatural ability to capture the uncanny, the ethereal, the moments that hovered just beyond the edge of normal perception. He was also a self-proclaimed paranormal enthusiast, a fact he announced with a playful wink, but one Sarah knew was deeply ingrained in who he was. He saw the world through a different lens, both literally and figuratively, and, while her own academic mind demanded evidence and reason, she found his perspective intriguing. Well, let's try to keep the spookiness to a minimum, shall we, she said, her tone light but with an undercurrent of seriousness. We have a tour group to entertain, not terrify. Where's the fun in that? Tommy retorted, but he gave her a reassuring nod. Don't worry, I'll be on my best behavior. I'll save the ghost hunting for after the tour. As if on cue, the first of the tour group began to arrive, their hushed voices and shuffling feet a stark contrast to the battlefield's profound silence. They were a motley crew, a mix of serious history buffs, curious tourists, and a handful of wide-eyed teenagers who were clearly hoping for a scare. Sarah took a deep breath, the familiar rhythm of her pre-tour routine taking over. She was in her element here, a storyteller weaving the threads of the past into a tapestry that was both educational and deeply human. She began her narration, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the assembled group. She spoke of the battle not as a dry recitation of facts and figures, but as a human drama, a story of courage, sacrifice, and heartbreaking loss. She pointed out the key positions, the ebb and flow of the fighting, the moments of desperate valor that had turned the tide of the war. Her words, honed by years of study and a deep, abiding love for this place, painted a vivid picture in her listeners' minds. They were no longer just standing on a patch of grass, they were standing on the very ground where the fate of a nation had been decided. As she spoke, Tommy moved through the group, his camera a silent, unobtrusive presence. He captured the rapt expressions on the listeners' faces, the way the last light of dusk caught the edges of the monuments, the deepening shadows that seemed to pool in the hollows of the land. He was a master of capturing atmosphere, of finding beauty in melancholy, and the story in stillness. And then, as if commanded by some unseen stage manager, the moon began its transformation. A dark, creeping shadow began to consume the bright, silvery disk, and a collective gasp went through the tour group. The air grew colder, a sudden, noticeable chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. A low-lying mist, thick and white and strangely luminous, began to coil around their ankles, a ghostly serpent slithering through the grass. Sarah paused in her narration, her own gaze drawn upward. The moon, now almost entirely engulfed in shadow, was beginning to glow with an eerie, coppery light. The blood moon. It was a sight that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, a celestial omen that had been interpreted in countless ways throughout human history, a sign of change, upheaval, and the thinning of the veil between worlds. It was then that she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the sigh of 1,000 voices carried on the wind. It was a sound she had heard before, a sound that was as much a part of Gettysburg as the monuments and the fields. But tonight it was different. It was louder, more precise, more insistent. It was as if the very air was vibrating with a sorrow that was too vast to be contained. The tour group grew restless, their nervous chatter breaking the spell that Sarah had so carefully woven. The teenagers, who had been hoping for a scare, now looked genuinely frightened. The history buffs, who had come for a lesson, now looked as if they were getting more than they had bargained for. Sarah, ever the professional, quickly brought the tour to a close. She thanked the group for their attention, her voice calm and reassuring, and directed them back towards the parking lot. But as they began to disperse, their flashlights cutting nervous swaths through the darkness, she saw Tommy standing apart from the group, his camera lowered, his face a mask of intense concentration. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice a low whisper as she approached him. "I heard it," she confirmed, her own voice barely audible. "The wind." Tommy shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the now blood-red moon. "That wasn't the wind, Sarah. And you know it." She didn't argue. She did know it. She had spent her entire life on this battlefield, a place where her own great-great-grandfather had fought and died. She had felt the presence of the past more times than she could count, a silent, watchful energy that was as real to her as the ground beneath her feet. But this was different. It was something more. As the last of the tour group's car lights disappeared down the road, a profound silence descended once more upon the battlefield. But it was not an empty silence. It was a silence that was filled with a palpable, waiting energy. A silence that seemed to be holding its breath. Sarah and Tommy stood there for a long moment, two small, solitary figures in the vast, moonlit landscape. The blood moon, now at its zenith, bathed the world in a crimson glow, transforming the familiar fields and monuments into a place of alien beauty and profound mystery. The mist, thicker now, swirled around them, obscuring the world beyond their small island of high ground. "We should go," Sarah said, but her words lacked conviction. Every instinct was telling her to leave, to get in her car and drive away from this place that was suddenly so strange and unsettling. But a deeper, more powerful impulse was telling her to stay. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, a pull, a sense of being needed, a feeling that she was on the cusp of a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about this place, about her own history, about the very nature of time itself. Tommy gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Not yet," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I think the show is just getting started." And as he spoke, a figure emerged from the mist. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the tattered, mud-stained uniform of a Union soldier. He moved with a strange, gliding motion, his feet seeming to float just above the ground. His face, pale and drawn in the crimson moonlight, was a mask of confusion and sorrow. He looked at them, his eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea, and then he was gone, dissolving back into the mist as silently as he had appeared. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage. The academic, the historian, the part of her that demanded reason and logic, was screaming at her to run. But the other part of her, the part that was a daughter of this soil, a descendant of the men who had fought and died here, was rooted to the spot, mesmerized, terrified, and utterly, irrevocably captivated. Tommy raised his camera, his hands steady, his movements slow and deliberate. He took a picture, the click of the shutter a slight, defiant sound in the face of the impossible. "I told you," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "The show is just getting started." And Sarah knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that he was right. They had crossed a threshold, a line between the world they knew and a world that had been waiting, just beneath the surface, for the right moment to reveal itself. Tonight, under the watchful eye of the blood moon, the past was no longer the past. It was here. It was now. And they were a part of it. The world, as Sarah had always known it, seemed to fracture and reform in the space of a single, silent heartbeat. The air, already thick with an almost supernatural tension, grew heavy, pressing in on them with a physical weight. The blood moon, now at the absolute peak of its totality, hung in the sky like a great, weeping wound, bathing the landscape in a light that was not of this earth. It was a light that seemed to strip away the veneer of the present, revealing the raw, unhealed scars of the past. The single, spectral soldier had been but a prelude, a gentle ripple before the tidal wave. Now, as if a dam had burst in the river of time, the battlefield began to fill with them. They emerged from the swirling mists, from the shadows of the monuments, from the very earth itself. They were a silent, spectral army, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their faces etched with a confusion that transcended the ages. Union and Confederate, they materialized side by side, their blue and gray uniforms faded to ghostly monotones in the crimson light. The enmity that had defined them in life seemed to have been washed away by the long, slow tide of death, leaving only a shared, bewildered sorrow. And then came the sounds. The distant, thunderous roar of cannons, a sound that vibrated not in the ears but deep within the chest. The sharp, staccato crack of rifle fire, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. And the cries. The terrible, heart-rending cries of the wounded and the dying, a chorus of agony that rose from the fields and echoed in the hollows of Sarah's soul. It was a symphony of chaos and despair, a soundscape that had been imprinted upon this land and was now being replayed, in all its terrible fidelity, for an audience of two. Sarah stood frozen, her mind a maelstrom of disbelief and terror. The historian in her, the part that had always dealt with the past as something safely contained in books and archives, was struggling to process the impossible reality unfolding before her. It was not a reenactment. It was not a hallucination. It was something real, something terrifying, viscerally real. Tommy, by her side, was a study in contrast. His face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his camera, but his eyes were wide with a kind of ecstatic wonder. He was not just seeing the impossible, he was embracing it. He raised his camera, his movements slow and deliberate, and began to take pictures, the click of the shutter a small, defiant act of witness in the face of overwhelming chaos. He was not just a photographer tonight, he was a chronicler, a historian of the impossible, his lens the only thing that could capture the truth of this spectral, blood-soaked night. Incredible, he breathed, his voice a reverent whisper. It's like the whole battle is happening all over again. But it wasn't just a reply. It was a collage, a jumble of moments from the 3 days of fighting, all happening at once. She saw men charging, their bayonets fixed, their silent shouts lost in the cacophony of the spectral battle. She saw men falling, their bodies crumpling to the ground in a silent pantomime of death. She saw surgeons, their aprons stained with ghostly blood, working frantically on the wounded in a makeshift field hospital that had not existed moments before. And then, through the swirling chaos, she saw him. He was different from the others. While the other spirits seemed to be trapped in a loop, reliving their final, agonizing moments, he was still. He stood near the angle, the stone wall that had been the high-water mark of the Confederacy, and he was watching them. His form was more solid, more defined than the others, and his eyes, even from a distance, held a spark of intelligence, of awareness, of a sorrow that was not just a memory, but a present, living emotion. He was a Union officer, a captain, his rank denoted by the tarnished, spectral bars on his shoulders. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a handsome, careworn face that was framed by a thick, dark beard. And there was something about him, something in the way he held himself, in the line of his jaw, in the deep sadness of his eyes, that was achingly, impossibly familiar. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head and looked directly at her. And in that moment, the cacophony of the spectral battle seemed to fade, the swirling chaos receded, and there was only the two of them, two souls connected across the vast, silent expanse of a century and a half. He began to walk towards them, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. He moved with a grace that was at odds with the tattered, blood-stained uniform he wore. He was not a ghost, he was a man who had been torn from the pages of history and given form and substance by the strange, mystical light of the blood moon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, now seemed to stop altogether. She knew him. She had seen that face 1,000 times, in the faded, sepia-toned photograph that sat on the mantelpiece in her parents' home. It was a face that had been passed down through the generations, a face that was a mirror, however faint, of her own. Captain Mitchell, she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. He stopped a few feet away from them, his eyes searching her face, a look of dawning recognition in their depths. He did not know her name, he could not have known it, but he knew her. He saw the echo of his own blood in the lines of her face, in the color of her eyes, in the very essence of her being. "You are of my line," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. It was a voice that had not spoken for 150 years, and yet it was as clear and as real as her own. Sarah could only nod, her throat tight with an emotion that was too vast, too complex to name. It was a mixture of awe, of fear, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow. She was standing face to face with her own history, a history that was no longer a story in a book, but a living, breathing man. Tommy, who had been watching this silent, intense exchange, slowly lowered his camera. The paranormal enthusiast in him was silenced, replaced by a sense of reverence, of being in the presence of something sacred. He was no longer just a witness to a supernatural event, he was a witness to a family reunion, a reunion orchestrated by the strange, mystical forces of the blood moon. Captain Mitchell's gaze shifted to Tommy, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "And you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite, formal, a relic of a bygone era. "Are you also of my blood?" Tommy shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "No, sir. I'm just a local. A friend." The captain nodded slowly, his gaze returning to Sarah. "A friend," he repeated, as if the word itself was a comfort. "She will need a friend tonight." His words, and the profound sadness with which he spoke to them, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "What is happening here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you all here?" The captain's gaze swept over the spectral battlefield, a look of infinite sorrow in his eyes. "We are the unfinished," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of a century of grief. "We are the stories that were never told, the songs that were never sung, the letters that were never sent. We are the echoes of a promise that was never fulfilled." He looked back at Sarah, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "This place, it holds us. It reminds us. And tonight, on this night of the bleeding moon, the memories have become real." He raised a hand, his fingers long and elegant, and pointed towards the swirling chaos of the spectral battle. "They are all as I am," he said. "Lost. Confused. Trapped in the final moments of their lives, with no understanding of what has come before, or what is to come after. They are caught in the storm, and they cannot find their way out." "And you?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "Are you also trapped?" A flicker of something that might have been pain, or regret, or a combination of both, crossed the captain's face. "I am their guide," he said, his voice barely audible. "I am the one who remembers. The one who sees. And the one who has been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Tommy asked, his curiosity overcoming his awe. The captain's gaze fell upon Sarah once more, and in his eyes, she saw the answer. He had been waiting for her. For a descendant, for a storyteller, for someone who could bridge the gap between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. He had been waiting for someone who could give a voice to the voiceless, who could tell the stories that had been lost to the winds of time. "I have a story to tell," he said, his voice growing stronger, more urgent. "A story that has been waiting a lifetime to be heard. And you, my dear descendant, are the one who must hear it." And as the blood moon cast its crimson benediction upon the hallowed ground of Gettysburg, Sarah knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of her being, that her life, her work, her entire understanding of the world, was about to be changed forever. She was no longer just a historian, she was a part of history. And the stories of the dead were now in her hands. The spectral battlefield, which had been a chaotic, terrifying maelstrom of sound and fury, now seemed to hold its breath, as if in deference to the story that was about to be told. The ghostly soldiers continued their silent, tragic pantomime. Still, their movements seemed more distant, their cries more muted, as if they were a backdrop to the intensely personal drama that was unfolding between the living and the dead. Captain Mitchell, his form solid and unwavering in the crimson moonlight, led them away from the crest of the ridge, his movements as sure and as certain as if he were still walking this land in the flesh. He guided them through the swirling mists and the spectral soldiers, a silent, sorrowful Virgil leading them through the circles of his own personal inferno. He took them to a small, secluded copse of trees, a place that Sarah had always known as a quiet, peaceful spot, a place to escape the summer crowds and the weight of the battlefield's sorrow. But tonight, it was a place of profound, heart-rending sadness. It was a makeshift field hospital, a place erased from maps and history books, but now as real and tangible as the trees that sheltered it. The air was thick with the spectral scent of blood and chloroform, and the ground was littered with the ghostly forms of wounded men, their groans a soft, constant murmur of agony. Surgeons, their faces grim and determined, moved among them, their spectral instruments flashing in the moonlight. "This is where my story ends," Captain Mitchell said, his voice a low, somber whisper. "And where it begins." He began to speak, his voice gaining strength and clarity as he unburdened himself of the story that he had carried, alone, for a century and a half. He spoke of the battle, of the chaos and the carnage of Pickett's charge, of the moment when the tide of the Confederacy had broken upon the stone wall at the angle and then receded, leaving behind a field of unimaginable human suffering. He had been wounded, a piece of shrapnel in his leg, but he had refused to leave the field. He had stayed with his men, offering what comfort he could, his heart breaking at the sight of so much death, so much waste. And then, as the sun began to set on the third day of fighting, he heard a cry. It was a young man, a boy really, no more than 16 or 17, his gray uniform stained with the bright, arterial red of a fatal wound. He was the enemy, Captain Mitchell said, his voice thick with an ancient sorrow. But in that moment, he was not a soldier. He was a boy, a son, a brother, and he was dying, alone, in a field far from his home. I would not let him die alone. He had crawled to the boy's side, ignoring the pain in his own leg, ignoring the danger of the sharpshooters who still lurked in the trees. He had taken the boy's hand, had spoken to him of home, of peace, of a world beyond the madness of this war. He had offered him a drink from his own canteen, a small act of kindness in a world that had gone mad. And it was then that he had been shot. A single, clean shot to the chest, fired by a sharpshooter who had seen not an act of compassion, but the uniform of an enemy. He had died there, in that field, his hand still holding the hand of the boy he had tried to save, his final act of humanity unrecorded, unseen, unknown. I do not seek glory, Captain Mitchell said, his voice a plea for understanding. I do not seek to have my name carved in stone. I seek only that the story be told, that it be known that even in the heart of the storm, there was a moment of peace. A moment of brotherhood. Sarah was weeping, silent tears streaming down her face. The story, in its simple, profound humanity, had broken through the wall of her academic detachment and pierced her to the very core. It was not just a story, it was her story. It was the story of her family, of the man whose blood flowed in her veins, of the legacy of compassion that had been passed down to her. Tommy, his usual humor completely gone, was staring at the captain with a look of profound respect. He had come here tonight seeking ghosts, seeking proof of the supernatural. But he had found something more. He had found a story of human courage, of a love that was stronger than the hatred of war. We will tell your story, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. I promise you. We will tell it. The captain gave her a small, sad smile. It is not just my story that needs to be told, he said, his gaze sweeping over the spectral forms of the wounded soldiers. They all have stories. They are all unfinished. And they are all trapped here, not by anger, but by the simple, human need to be remembered. And so, under the watchful eye of the blood moon, they began their work. Guided by Captain Mitchell, they moved through the spectral field hospital, a strange and unlikely trio comprising a historian, a photographer, and a ghost. They stopped at the side of each wounded soldier, and Captain Mitchell would tell their story. He knew them all, their names, their hometowns, the families they had left behind. He spoke of their lives, not their deaths, of the dreams they had cherished, the loves they had lost, the simple, ordinary moments that had made up the sum of their existence. And as he spoke, a strange and beautiful thing began to happen. The soldiers, who had been trapped in their final, agonizing moments, began to grow still. The pain seemed to fade from their spectral faces, replaced by a look of peace, of release. It was as if the simple act of being remembered was enough to free them from their earthly bonds. Sarah, her historian's mind now working in concert with her compassionate heart, began to record the names, the details, the stories. She used the voice recorder on her phone, her voice a low, steady counterpoint to the captain's somber narration. She was no longer just a historian, she was a scribe, a keeper of the forgotten, a voice for the voiceless. Tommy, in his own way, was doing the same. He took pictures, not of the spectral forms, but of the places where they lay. He captured the way the moonlight fell on a particular patch of grass, the way the mist coiled around a particular tree. He was creating a visual record, a map of memory, a testament to the lives lost in this sacred, sorrowful place. Their quest for understanding, for the validation of Captain Mitchell's story, led them to a small, dilapidated shed at the edge of the copse of trees. It was a place that Sarah had never noticed before, a place that seemed to exist only in this strange, moonlit world. Inside, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, was a small, leather-bound trunk. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it. And inside, nestled among a collection of rusted surgical instruments and faded medical texts, was a journal. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of a man of education and refinement. It was the journal of a Confederate surgeon, Alastair Finch. And on the final page, dated July 3, 1863, was an entry that made Sarah's heart stop. "The fighting has ended," the entry began. "The field is a sea of blood and suffering. I have done what I can, but there are too many. God help us, there are too many. But even in this hell, I witnessed a moment of grace. I saw a Union captain, a man of courage and compassion, risk his own life to give comfort to one of our own, a young boy from Georgia. He was shot for his troubles, a martyr to a cause that is greater than any flag, any nation. I do not know his name, but I will carry the memory of his face, and his final, selfless act, to my grave." Sarah read the words aloud, her voice choked with emotion. The proof. The validation. The story that had been lost to the winds of time, now found, now known. She looked at Captain Mitchell. He was smiling, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The sorrow that had been etched on his face for a century and a half was gone, replaced by a look of profound, transcendent peace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a sigh of release. "Thank you." And as the first, faint hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a wave of peace, of closure, of understanding, washed over the spectral battlefield. The work was not yet done, but the tide had turned. The unfinished business was finally being brought to a close. The discovery of the surgeon's journal was a turning point, a fulcrum upon which the entire, spectral night seemed to pivot. The words, written in a faded, elegant script, were more than just a historical record, they were a key, a catalyst, a final missing piece of a puzzle scattered for a century and a half. As Sarah read the account of Captain Mitchell's final, selfless act, her voice, clear and steady in the pre-dawn stillness, seemed to resonate with a power that was not her own. It was a voice that carried the weight of history, the conviction of truth, and the profound, healing power of remembrance. A palpable change swept across the battlefield. It was not a sudden, dramatic shift, but a slow, gentle wave of peace, of release, of a long-awaited and deeply earned closure. The spectral soldiers, who had been trapped in their endless, silent loops of agony and confusion, began to fade. Their forms, which had been so solid and real in the crimson light of the blood moon, now grew soft and translucent, their edges blurring into the swirling mists. The sounds of battle, the cannon's roar, the rifle's crack, the cries of the wounded, all faded into a profound, all-encompassing silence. It was the silence of a story that has been told, of a song that has been sung, of a peace that has, at long last, been found. The soldiers did not vanish in a flash of light or a puff of smoke. They dissolved. They became one with the mist, with the moonlight, with the very earth that had cradled them in their final moments. And as they faded, the sorrow that had hung so heavily in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of gratitude, of a quiet, dignified farewell. They were no longer unfinished, they were remembered. And in being remembered, they were, at last, free. Captain Mitchell stood beside Sarah, his form also beginning to fade, but his smile was radiant, his eyes filled with a light that was not of this world. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and translucent, and gently touched her cheek. His touch was not cold, as she had expected, but warm, a gentle, loving caress that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a soft, gentle echo on the morning air. "You have given us the one thing we could not find for ourselves. You have given us peace." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had transcended the boundaries of time and death. "You gave me the story," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a gift." He nodded, his smile widening. "It is a gift that you must now share," he said, his voice beginning to fade. "Tell our stories, all of them. Let the world know that even in the darkest of nights, there is always the possibility of light. Of compassion. Of love." And then he was gone. He did not dissolve into the mist like the others, but seemed to be drawn upward, into the first, faint rays of the rising sun. He was a creature of the night, a ghost of the past, but he was returning to the light, his long, lonely vigil at an end. As the last of the spirits faded and the blood moon receded, its crimson glow replaced by the soft, gentle light of a new day, the battlefield returned to its familiar, tranquil state. The mist, which had been a shroud, a veil between worlds, now burned away, revealing the dew-kissed fields, the silent, stoic monuments, the world of the living reborn in the morning light. Sarah and Tommy stood alone on the ridge crest, two small, solitary figures in the vast, silent landscape. They were exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but they were also profoundly, irrevocably changed. The world, which had seemed so solid, so predictable just a few short hours ago, was now a place of infinite possibility, of mystery, of a magic that was as real and as tangible as the ground beneath their feet. Sarah looked at the surgeon's journal, still clutched in her hand. It was more than just a historical artifact, it was a testament, a sacred text, a symbol of the bridge that had been built, on this night, between the past and the present. She had come to this battlefield seeking to understand history, but she had found something more. She had found her own story, her own purpose, her own unique place in the long, unbroken chain of human compassion. Tommy, his camera now hanging forgotten at his side, was staring at the sunrise, his face a mask of awe and wonder. He had captured the most incredible photographs of his life, images that would defy all explanation, images that skeptics would dismiss as tricks of light or digital manipulations. But he knew the truth. He had seen the impossible, had witnessed the miraculous, and he was no longer just a photographer. He was a guardian of the mystery, a keeper of the faith, a man who had learned that his sensitivity was not a curse, but a gift, a way of seeing the world in all its strange, beautiful, and heartbreaking glory. They stood there for a long time, in a comfortable, companionable silence, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, chasing away the last of the shadows, bathing the world in a warm, golden light. The battlefield, which had been a place of such profound sorrow, now seemed to be a place of profound peace. The ghosts of Gettysburg had, at last, found their rest. What now? Tommy asked, his voice soft in the morning stillness. Sarah looked at him, a small, determined smile on her face. Now, she said, her voice filled with a newfound sense of purpose, we tell their stories. And as they walked off the battlefield, side by side, into the light of a new day, they were no longer just a historian and a photographer. They were storytellers, messengers, bearers of a truth that was as old as the hills and as new as the morning sun. The truth is that love is stronger than death, that compassion is more powerful than hatred, and that the stories of the past, when told with an open heart, have the power to heal us all. And so, if you ever find yourself on a quiet, historic battlefield, as the sun begins to set and the shadows begin to lengthen, take a moment to listen. Listen for the whispers on the wind, for the echoes in the silence. The past is never truly past. It is always with us, waiting to be heard, waiting to be understood, waiting to be healed. And sometimes, if you are fortunate, and if the moon is just right, you might find that the stories of the past are not just stories. They are invitations. Invitations to connect, to understand, to remember. And in remembering, to become a part of a story that is larger than ourselves, a story that is as vast, as beautiful, and as eternal as the stars themselves. 3 months had passed since that extraordinary night under the blood moon, and Sarah Mitchell found herself standing once again on the crest of Cemetery Ridge. But this time, she was not alone. A small crowd had gathered around her, their faces illuminated by the warm, golden light of an autumn afternoon. They were a diverse group, historians, students, residents, and tourists, all drawn by the story that had begun to spread, quietly but persistently, through the community of Civil War enthusiasts and paranormal researchers. The story of Captain James Mitchell and the Confederate Surgeon's Journal had been published in several historical journals, each article meticulously researched and documented. Sarah had been careful to present the facts as she had found them, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. She had not mentioned the supernatural events of that night, the spectral soldiers, the blood moon's mystical influence. Those details remained her secret, shared only with Tommy, a sacred trust between two people who had witnessed the impossible. However, the story itself, the account of a Union captain's final act of compassion, had resonated deeply with readers. It was a story that transcended the political divisions of the Civil War, a story that spoke to the fundamental humanity that exists even in the darkest of times. There was a story that reminded people that history is not just about battles and politics, but about individual acts of courage, kindness, and love. Sarah had also established a small memorial fund in Captain Mitchell's name, dedicated to preserving the stories of the forgotten soldiers of the Gettysburg campaign. The fund had grown steadily, supported by donations from people whom the captains had moved. It was used to digitize old letters, diaries, and photographs, creating an online archive where future generations could hear the voices of the past. Tommy had become an integral part of this effort. His photographs from that night, while they showed no spectral figures, captured something else entirely. They captured the atmosphere, the emotion, the profound sense of history that permeated the battlefield. His images had been featured in several exhibitions, and he had become something of a local celebrity, known for his ability to capture a place's soul in a single frame. But more importantly, Tommy had discovered a new purpose for his sensitivity to the supernatural. He had begun working with other historical sites, utilizing his unique abilities to help identify areas of particular significance, places where the past seemed to linger with unusual intensity. He had become a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a translator of whispers, a chronicler of the forgotten. As Sarah spoke to the gathered crowd, telling them the story of Captain Mitchell and the Confederate boy, she felt a familiar presence. It was not the captain himself, his spirit had found its peace and moved on. But it was something else, a sense of approval, gratitude, and a job well done. The battlefield, which had once been a place of unresolved sorrow, now felt different. It felt lighter, more peaceful, as if a great weight had been lifted from its shoulders. The crowd listened in rapt attention as Sarah recounted the discovery of the surgeon's journal, the validation of the captain's story, and the proof that even in the midst of war, compassion could triumph over hatred. She spoke of the importance of remembering not just the famous generals and grand strategies, but also the individual soldiers, the ordinary men who had found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. When she finished her talk, a young woman approached her. She was in her early 20s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Sarah of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. Ms. Mitchell, the young woman said, her voice soft but determined. My name is Emily Finch. I believe my great-great-grandfather was the surgeon who wrote that journal. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She looked at the young woman more closely, and now she could see the resemblance. The same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to the jaw, the same aura of quiet strength that she had sensed in the surgeon's elegant handwriting. Dr. Alistair Finch, Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. He was your ancestor? Emily nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I've been researching my family history for years, trying to piece together his story. He disappeared after the war, and we never knew what happened to him. But when I read your article and saw the excerpts from his journal, I knew I was him. The handwriting, the way he wrote, was exactly like the letters he sent home to his family. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. I brought this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's another one of his journals, from before the war. I thought you might like to see it. Sarah took the journal reverently, her heart pounding with excitement. As she opened it, she saw page after page of the same elegant handwriting, the same thoughtful observations, the same compassionate voice that had spoken across the centuries to validate Captain Mitchell's story. There's something else, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. In his letters home, he mentioned a Union captain who showed extraordinary kindness to a wounded Confederate soldier. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed, and that it gave him hope that the war hadn't destroyed all the goodness in the world. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The circle was complete. The story that had begun with a spectral encounter under a blood moon had now come full circle, connecting not just the past and the present, but the descendants of both the Union captain and the Confederate surgeon who had witnessed his final act of compassion. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and Emily walked together across the battlefield, their conversation flowing easily, as if they were old friends rather than strangers who had just met. They discussed their ancestors, the war, and the importance of preserving these stories for future generations. And as they walked, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion, of a mission accomplished, of a story finally told in its entirety. Tommy joined them as they reached the angle, his camera capturing the golden light of the setting sun as it painted the monuments in warm, honey-colored hues. He had been photographing the crowd during Sarah's talk, but now he was focused on something else entirely. He was capturing the moment, the connection, the living bridge between past and present that was being forged before his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think this is just the beginning." Sarah looked at him questioningly, and he gestured toward the battlefield, toward the monuments, and toward the vast, rolling landscape that held so many stories and secrets. "There are other stories out there," he said. "Other voices waiting to be heard. Other connections waiting to be made. What happened that night, what we experienced, wasn't just about Captain Mitchell. It was about all of them. All the forgotten, all the unremembered." Emily, who had been listening intently, nodded in agreement. "My great-great-grandfather wrote about other soldiers, too, other acts of kindness and courage that were never recorded. There are so many stories that have been lost to time." Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the same sense of purpose that had driven her to become a historian in the first place. But now it was deeper, more personal, more urgent. She had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the veil of time, and with that gift came a responsibility. "Then we'll find them," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll tell their stories. All of them." And as the three of them stood there, on the hallowed ground of Gettysburg, watching the sun set over the battlefield where so many had given their lives for their beliefs, they made a pact. They would dedicate themselves to preserving the stories of the forgotten, to giving voice to the voiceless, and to ensuring that the lessons of compassion and humanity learned in the crucible of war would not be lost to time. The blood moon had been a catalyst, a moment of supernatural intervention that had opened a door between worlds. But the real magic, the lasting magic, was in the connections that had been forged, the stories that had been told, the healing that had begun. It was a magic available to anyone willing to listen, to remember, and to honor the past while building a better future. As they walked back toward the parking lot, their footsteps echoing softly on the paved path, Sarah felt a sense of peace that she had never experienced before. She had found her calling, her purpose, her place in the great, ongoing story of human history. She was no longer just a historian, she was a healer, a bridge builder, a keeper of the sacred flame of memory. The battlefield, bathed in the soft, purple light of twilight, seemed to whisper its approval. The ghosts of Gettysburg had found their peace, but their stories lived on, carried forward by the living, retold and remembered, and honored. And in that remembrance, in that honoring, there was a kind of immortality, a way for the past to live on in the present, for the dead to speak to the living, for love to triumph over death. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a night of miracles, a night when the impossible had become possible, when the veil between worlds had been lifted, when the voices of the past had spoken with clarity and power. But the real miracle was not in the supernatural events that had occurred. The real miracle was in the human connections that had been forged, the stories that had been preserved, the healing that had begun. And as Sarah drove home through the quiet Pennsylvania countryside, the surgeon's journal carefully placed on the seat beside her, she knew that this was not the end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in her life, a new mission, a new way of understanding the profound, unbreakable bonds that connect us all across the vast expanse of time. The ghosts of Gettysburg had taught her that death is not the end of the story. It is simply a transition, a passage from one form of existence to another. The love, the courage, the compassion that define us in life continue to resonate long after our physical forms have returned to dust. They live on in the stories we tell, in the memories we preserve, in the connections we forge with those who come after us. And sometimes, on very special nights, when the moon is just right and the veil between worlds grows thin, those stories come alive. They speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of becoming. They remind us that we are all part of a larger story, a story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been one such night. A night when the past and present had collided, when the living and the dead had walked together, when the power of love and compassion had triumphed over the darkness of war and death. It had been a night of healing, of closure, of profound, transformative understanding. And in the end, that is what history is really about. Not dates and battles and political movements, but the human stories that give meaning to it all. The stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of love persisting in the face of hatred, of hope surviving in the darkest of times. These are the stories that matter, the stories that heal, the stories that connect us all in the great, ongoing tapestry of human experience. The blood moon over Gettysburg had reminded Sarah of this truth, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life. She would tell the stories, preserve the memories, and honor the past while building a better future. She would be a voice for the voiceless, a light in the darkness, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And somewhere, in the quiet, peaceful fields of Gettysburg, the spirits of the past would smile, knowing that their stories lived on, that their sacrifices had not been forgotten, that their love had found a way to transcend the boundaries of time and death. The blood moon had set, but its light would shine forever in the hearts of those who had witnessed its magic, who had heard its message, and whose lives it had transformed. It is the story of the blood moon over Gettysburg. A story of love and loss, of war and peace, of the past and the present, of the living and the dead. It is a story that reminds us that we are all connected, all part of a larger whole, all threads in the great tapestry of human experience. And it is a story that will continue to be told, as long as there are people who believe in the power of love to heal, the importance of memory to preserve, and the magic that exists in the space between what was and what is yet to come. The weeks following Sarah's first public presentation of Captain Mitchell's story brought an unexpected flood of correspondence. Letters arrived daily at the Gettysburg National Military Park, addressed to Sarah Mitchell, each one containing a piece of the vast, complex puzzle that was the human experience of the Civil War. Some were descendants of soldiers who fought at Gettysburg, sharing family stories passed down through generations. Others were from historians and researchers who had uncovered similar accounts of compassion and humanity amidst the carnage of war. But perhaps the most intriguing correspondence came from an older woman named Margaret Whitmore, who lived in a small town in Virginia. Her letter, written in a shaky but determined hand, told a story that made Sarah's heart race with excitement and anticipation. Margaret's great-grandfather, she wrote, had been a young Confederate soldier at Gettysburg, barely 18 years old when he marched north with Lee's army. He had been wounded during Pickett's charge and left for dead on the field. But he had survived, she claimed, because of the kindness of a Union officer who had given him water and comfort in his final moments of consciousness. The family had always believed that this act of compassion had somehow saved his life, that the Union officer's kindness had given him the strength to survive until the stretcher-bearers found him the next morning. What made Margaret's letter particularly compelling was her description of her great-grandfather's account of the Union officer. He had described him as a tall, bearded man with kind eyes, a captain by his rank, who had spoken to him of home and peace and the hope that the war would soon end. The description matched Captain Mitchell perfectly, and Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine as she read the letter. But there was more. Margaret's great-grandfather had kept a small, leather-bound diary throughout the war, in which he recorded not only the events of the battles he fought but also his thoughts and feelings about the conflict, including his homesickness, fears, and hopes for the future. Margaret had carefully preserved this diary and was willing to share it with Sarah if she thought it might be helpful in her research. Sarah immediately wrote back to Margaret, expressing her deep interest in the diary and arranging to visit Virginia to examine it in person. The prospect of finding another piece of Captain Mitchell's story, another validation of his compassion and humanity, filled her with a sense of excitement and purpose that she had not felt since that extraordinary night under the blood moon. Tommy, when she told him about Margaret's letter, was equally intrigued. He had been working on a photographic project documenting lesser-known sites on the Gettysburg battlefield, places where individual acts of heroism and compassion had occurred. Still, he was not marked by monuments or memorials. The idea of traveling to Virginia to photograph the places where Margaret's great-grandfather had lived and died appealed to his sense of adventure and his commitment to preserving these forgotten stories. They made the trip to Virginia on a crisp, clear day in late October, the autumn leaves painting the countryside in brilliant shades of red and gold. Margaret Whitmore lived in a small, white farmhouse that had been in her family for generations, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees that seemed to whisper with the voices of the past. Margaret herself was a woman in her 80s, with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes that sparkled with the same curiosity and passion for history that Sarah recognized in herself. She welcomed them warmly, serving tea and homemade cookies in a parlor that was filled with family photographs and Civil War memorabilia. The diary, when she brought it out, was a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was that of a young man, sometimes hurried and careless, sometimes careful and deliberate, reflecting the varying circumstances under which the entries had been written. As Sarah opened it and began to read, she felt as if she were being transported back in time, experiencing the war through the eyes of a frightened, homesick boy who had found himself caught up in events far beyond his understanding or control. The entries from the days leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg were particularly poignant. The young soldier, whose name was William Whitmore, wrote of his fears about the upcoming battle, his longing for home, and his doubts about the cause for which he was fighting. He wrote of his fellow soldiers, some of whom were little more than boys like himself, others who were seasoned veterans with haunted eyes and grim expressions. He wrote of the officers, some of whom he respected and admired, others whom he feared and despised. But it was the entry dated July 3, 1863, that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Written in a shaky, barely legible hand, it told the story of William's participation in Pickett's charge, his wounding, and his encounter with the Union officer who had shown him such unexpected kindness. "I thought I was going to die," William had written. "The pain was terrible, and I could feel my life ebbing away like water from a broken pitcher. But then he came, this Union captain with the kind eyes and the gentle voice. He gave me water from his own canteen, and he spoke to me of home, of my family, of the peace that would come when this terrible war was over. I don't know his name, and I suppose I never will, but I will carry the memory of his kindness with me for the rest of my life. He showed me that even in the midst of this hell, there is still goodness in the world, compassion, hope." Sarah read the passage aloud, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes, nodding as she recognized the story that had been passed down through her family for generations. "He lived to be 93, Margaret said softly. "He always said that the Union captain saved his life, not just physically, but spiritually. He said that the encounter changed him, making him a better person and more compassionate. He spent the rest of his life trying to live up to the example that the captain had set for him." Tommy, who had been quietly taking photographs of the diary and the farmhouse, looked up from his camera. "Did he ever try to find out who the captain was?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "He tried, but there were so many officers, so many casualties. The records were incomplete, and he had very little to go on. Just the memory of a kind face and a gentle voice in the midst of all that chaos and suffering." Sarah felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle were being closed. Here was another piece of Captain Mitchell's story, another life that his compassion had touched, another validation of the power of human kindness to transcend the boundaries of conflict and hatred. However, as they prepared to leave Virginia, Margaret had one more surprise in store for them. She led them to a small cemetery behind the farmhouse, where generations of Whitmores had been laid to rest. At the far end of the cemetery, beneath a simple granite headstone, lay William Whitmore himself. He asked to be buried here, Margaret explained, on the land where he was born, surrounded by the family he loved. But he also asked for something else to be buried with him. She knelt beside the grave and pointed to a small, weathered stone that had been placed at the foot of the headstone. Carved into the stone, in letters that were barely visible after more than a century of wind and rain, were the words, "In memory of the Union captain who showed kindness to an enemy." Sarah knelt beside the grave, her hand tracing the faded letters on the headstone. Here was a monument to Captain Mitchell's compassion, a testament to the lasting impact of his final act of humanity. It was not a grand memorial, not a towering statue or an elaborate monument, but it was perhaps more meaningful than any of those. It was a personal tribute, a private acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. As they drove back to Pennsylvania, the diary carefully secured in Sarah's bag, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. The story of Captain Mitchell was growing, expanding, becoming something larger than she had ever imagined. It was no longer just the story of one man's final act of compassion, it was becoming a testament to the power of human kindness to ripple outward through time, touching lives and changing hearts across the generations. Back in Gettysburg, Sarah began to piece together the larger picture. She had Captain Mitchell's story, validated by the Confederate Surgeon's Journal. She had William Whitmore's account, preserved in his diary and honored by his family for more than a century. And she was beginning to suspect that there were other stories out there, other lives that the captain's compassion had touched, other ripples in the vast pond of human experience. Her suspicions were confirmed when she received a call from a historian at the University of Virginia. Dr. Elizabeth Harper had read Sarah's articles about Captain Mitchell and had been intrigued by the story. She had been researching the aftermath of Gettysburg, particularly the experiences of wounded soldiers who had survived the battle, and had come across several accounts that seemed to refer to the same Union officer. "I think your Captain Mitchell may have helped more people than you realize, Dr. Harper said during their phone conversation. "I've found at least 3 other accounts, all from Confederate soldiers who were wounded during Pickett's charge, all describing a Union captain who showed them unexpected kindness. The descriptions are remarkably consistent, and they all mention the same details, the kind eyes, the gentle voice, the offer of water and comfort." Sarah felt her heart racing with excitement. If Dr. Harper was correct, then Captain Mitchell's story was even more remarkable than she had imagined. He had not just helped one wounded enemy, he had helped several, risking his own life repeatedly to show compassion to those who had been trying to kill him just moments before. They arranged to meet at the University of Virginia, where Dr. Harper had assembled a collection of documents and accounts related to the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Sarah found herself counting the days with an anticipation that reminded her of a child waiting for Christmas. Tommy, meanwhile, had been having his own revelations. Several experts had examined his photographs from that night, taken under the blood moon, in the context of paranormal photography. While they found no evidence of digital manipulation or trickery, they could not explain some of the anomalies in the images. There were areas of unusual light, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, and what appeared to be faces in the mist that could not be accounted for by any natural phenomenon. But more intriguingly, Tommy had begun to experience what he described as echoes when he visited certain areas of the battlefield. He would be photographing a particular spot, and suddenly, he would hear faint and distant voices speaking words that he could not quite make out. He would feel a sudden chill, or a sense of being watched, or an overwhelming emotion that seemed to come from outside himself. At first, he had dismissed these experiences as the result of his imagination, the product of spending too much time thinking about ghosts and supernatural phenomena. But as they became more frequent and more intense, he began to suspect that his encounter with Captain Mitchell had somehow opened a door in his perception, allowing him to sense things that had previously been beyond his awareness. He had begun keeping a journal of these experiences, noting the locations where they occurred, the time of day, the weather conditions, and any other relevant factors. A pattern was beginning to emerge. The experiences were most intense in areas where significant casualties had occurred, particularly where acts of individual heroism or compassion had occurred. It was as if the battlefield itself were a repository of memory, a vast, living archive of human experience that could be accessed by those with the sensitivity to perceive it. And Tommy, it seemed, had developed that sensitivity as a result of his encounter with the supernatural on that night under the blood moon. Sarah found Tommy's experiences both fascinating and slightly unsettling. As a historian, she was trained to rely on documented evidence, facts that could be verified and substantiated. But her own experience that night had shown her that there were aspects of reality that could not be captured in documents or photographs, truths that could only be perceived through direct, personal experience. She began to accompany Tommy on his photographic expeditions, not just as a historian providing context and background, but as a fellow seeker of truth, someone open to the possibility that the past was not as distant or inaccessible as she had once believed. Together, they explored the lesser-known areas of the battlefield, where individual dramas had unfolded away from the main action. They visited the sites of field hospitals, the locations where acts of heroism had occurred, the spots where enemies had shown kindness to each other in the midst of the chaos and carnage. And gradually, a larger picture began to emerge. The Battle of Gettysburg was not only a clash of armies but also a strategic turning point in the American Civil War. It had been a crucible of human experience, a place where the best and worst of human nature had been revealed in stark, dramatic terms. It had been a place where ordinary men had been called upon to perform extraordinary acts of courage, compassion, and sacrifice. The stories that Sarah and Tommy were uncovering were not just historical curiosities. They were testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit, evidence of the capacity for goodness that exists even in the darkest of circumstances. They were reminders that history is not just about the grand sweep of events, but about the individual choices people make in moments of crisis, as well as the small acts of kindness that can have profound and lasting consequences. As the autumn deepened and the anniversary of their encounter with Captain Mitchell approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the changes that had occurred in her life over the past year. She had begun the previous October as a competent but somewhat conventional historian, passionate about the past but approaching it primarily through books, documents, and official records. Now, she was something different. She was still a historian, but she was also a storyteller, a bridge between the past and the present, someone who understood that history was not just about what had happened, but about what those events meant to the people who had lived through them and to those who came after. She had also become something of a celebrity in the world of Civil War history. Her articles about Captain Mitchell had been widely read and discussed, and she had been invited to speak at conferences and symposiums across the country. Publishers had approached her about writing a book, and documentary filmmakers had expressed interest in telling the story of her discoveries. But perhaps most importantly, she had found a sense of purpose and meaning that had been missing from her life before. She was no longer just preserving the past, she was helping to heal it, giving voice to the voiceless, and ensuring that the lessons of compassion and humanity learned in the crucible of war would not be forgotten. Tommy, too, had been transformed by their experiences. His photographs had garnered national attention, and he had been commissioned to create a series of images that documented the hidden stories of the Civil War. But more than that, he had found a way to harness his unique sensitivity to serve a larger purpose, helping to preserve and share the stories of those who had been forgotten by history. As the first anniversary of the blood moon approached, Sarah and Tommy found themselves drawn back to the battlefield, to the place where their extraordinary journey had begun. They arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in the same brilliant shades of orange and purple that had preceded the eclipse a year before. The battlefield was quiet, peaceful, bathed in the soft, golden light of autumn. The tourists had gone home, the park was officially closed, but Sarah and Tommy had special permission to be there, to commemorate the anniversary of their discovery in the place where it had all begun. They strolled across the field, retracing the steps they had taken that night, recalling the fear, wonder, and awe that had filled them as they witnessed the impossible. The memories were still vivid, still robust, still capable of sending chills down their spines and bringing tears to their eyes. As they reached the crest of Cemetery Ridge, the place where they had first encountered Captain Mitchell, Sarah felt a familiar presence. It was not the captain himself, she knew that his spirit had found its peace and moved on. But it was something else, a sense of approval, gratitude, and a job well done. The moon, full and bright in the clear autumn sky, cast its silver light across the battlefield, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and mysterious. It was not a blood moon tonight, but it was beautiful in its own way, a reminder of the cycles of time, the eternal dance of light and shadow, life and death, past and present. As they stood there, two small figures in the vast, moonlit landscape, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion and continuity. The story of Captain Mitchell had been told, his compassion remembered and honored, and his legacy preserved for future generations. But more than that, his example had inspired others to seek out and preserve similar stories, to ensure that the voices of the forgotten would not be lost to the passage of time. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a catalyst, a moment of supernatural intervention that had opened a door between worlds. But the real magic, the lasting magic, was in the human connections that had been forged, the stories that had been told, the healing that had begun. As Sarah and Tommy walked back across the battlefield, their footsteps echoing softly in the moonlit silence, they knew their work was far from over. There were other stories to be told, other voices to be heard, other connections to be made between the past and the present. The ghosts of Gettysburg had taught them that love is stronger than death, that compassion is more powerful than hatred, and that the stories of the past, when told with an open heart, can heal us all. It was a lesson that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a truth that would guide them as they continued their work of preserving and sharing the forgotten stories of history. The blood moon had set, but its light would shine forever in the hearts of those who had witnessed its magic, heard its message, and had their power transformed. And in that light, the past and the present would continue to dance together, creating new stories, new connections, and new possibilities for understanding, healing, and hope. 5 years had passed since that transformative night under the blood moon, and the ripple effects of Sarah Mitchell's discovery continued to spread outward like concentric circles on a still pond. What had begun as a single story about a Union captain's act of compassion had grown into something much larger and more significant, a movement to preserve and honor the forgotten stories of the Civil War, a network of historians, researchers, and descendants working together to ensure that the human dimension of history would not be lost to time. The Captain James Mitchell Memorial Foundation, established 2 years after the discovery, had become a respected and influential organization in the field of Civil War history. Under Sarah's directorship and Tommy's chief photographer and archivist role, the foundation had documented hundreds of previously unknown stories of compassion, heroism, and humanity from the war. They had created an extensive digital archive, published several books, and produced a documentary film that had been broadcast on national television. But perhaps more importantly, they had inspired a new generation of historians and researchers to look beyond the grand narratives of battles and politics to the individual stories of the men and women who had lived through those tumultuous times. Universities across the country had established programs in compassionate history, focusing on the human dimension of historical events. High school students were writing essays about their own ancestors' experiences in the war, uncovering family stories that had been forgotten or suppressed for generations. Sarah herself had become a nationally recognized expert on the human dimension of the Civil War. She had written 3 books, the most recent of which, Voices from the Battlefield, Stories of Compassion in the Civil War, had become a bestseller and had been nominated for several prestigious awards. She had been invited to speak at conferences and universities around the world, sharing not just the story of Captain Mitchell, but also the larger message about the importance of remembering and honoring the individual human experiences that comprise the fabric of history. But success had not changed her fundamental approach to her work. She remained committed to the careful, meticulous research that had always characterized her scholarship, and she never forgot the profound, transformative experience that had started her on this path. She still returned to Gettysburg regularly, walking the battlefield in the early morning hours when the mist clung to the fields and the voices of the past seemed to whisper on the wind. Tommy, too, had found his calling in the Foundation's work. His photographs had been exhibited in galleries and museums across the country, and his unique ability to capture the emotional essence of historical sites had made him one of the most sought-after photographers in his field. But more than that, his sensitivity to the supernatural had continued to develop and deepen, allowing him to identify sites of particular historical significance that might otherwise have been overlooked. He had documented battlefields across the country, from Antietam to Shiloh to Chancellorsville, always searching for the places where individual acts of heroism and compassion had occurred. His photographs were not just artistic images, they were historical documents, capturing the atmosphere and emotion of places where the past seemed to linger with unusual intensity. The Foundation's work had also drawn the attention of other researchers and organizations worldwide. They had been contacted by historians studying conflicts in other countries and other time periods, all seeking to apply the same principles of compassionate history to their own research. The message that had emerged from that night under the blood moon, that individual acts of kindness and compassion can transcend the boundaries of conflict and hatred, had proven to be universal, relevant to human conflicts throughout history and around the world. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the establishment of the International Network for Compassionate History, a consortium of researchers and organizations dedicated to preserving and sharing stories of humanity in times of conflict. Sarah had been elected as the network's first president, a role that had taken her to conferences and research sites worldwide. She had traveled to Europe to document stories from World War I and World War II, to Asia to research conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, to Africa to study civil wars and tribal conflicts. Everywhere she went, she found the same pattern. Even in the darkest and most brutal conflicts, there were always individuals who chose compassion over hatred, who risked their own lives to help their enemies, who maintained their humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. These stories, she had come to realize, were not just historical curiosities. They were essential to understanding the true nature of human conflict and the possibilities for reconciliation and healing. They were proof that even in the worst of circumstances, the human capacity for goodness and compassion could not be wholly extinguished. The Foundation had also begun working with veterans organizations, helping to document and preserve the stories of modern conflicts. They had interviewed veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, collecting accounts of acts of compassion and humanity that had occurred in the midst of those wars. Many of these veterans had been deeply moved by the story of Captain Mitchell, seeing in his example a validation of their own experiences and a reminder that their acts of kindness and compassion, however small, had meaning and value. One particularly poignant project had involved working with a group of Vietnam veterans who had returned to Vietnam to build schools and hospitals in villages that had been damaged during the war. These men, who had once been soldiers fighting in those same villages, had chosen to return as healers and builders, dedicating their retirement years to repairing the damage inflicted decades earlier. Their stories, documented by Tommy's photographs and Sarah's interviews, had become some of the most powerful and moving accounts in the Foundation's archive. They were proof that the cycle of violence and hatred could be broken, that former enemies could become friends, that the wounds of war could be healed through acts of compassion and understanding. As Sarah reflected on the 5 years that had passed since that extraordinary night, she was struck by how a single moment of supernatural intervention had led to far-reaching, lasting consequences. The appearance of Captain Mitchell's spirit had been brief, lasting only a few hours. Still, its impact had continued to grow, touching thousands of lives and changing how people thought about history, conflict, and the possibilities for human redemption. She often wondered what would have happened if she and Tommy had not been on the battlefield that night, if they had not been open to the impossible, if they had dismissed what they had seen as hallucination or imagination. Would Captain Mitchell's story have remained forever lost? Would the other stories they had uncovered have continued to languish in forgotten archives and family attics? The thought filled her with a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. She had been chosen, in some mysterious way, to be the vessel through which these stories could be told. She had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the veil of time, and with that gift had come the obligation to use it wisely and well. The Foundation's work had also had a personal dimension for Sarah. Through her research, she had traced her family's history back several generations, uncovering stories of her ancestors that had been lost to time. She had learned about her great-great-grandmother, Captain Mitchell's wife, who had waited faithfully for his return from the war and spent the rest of her life helping other war widows and orphans. She had discovered letters and photographs stored in attics and basements, family treasures forgotten but not lost. Most significantly, she had been able to visit the small cemetery in Pennsylvania where Captain Mitchell was buried. His grave had been unmarked for more than a century, lost among the hundreds of other Union soldiers who had been interred there after the battle. But through careful research and the help of cemetery records, she had been able to locate it and arrange for a proper headstone to be placed there. The dedication ceremony for the headstone had been a profoundly moving experience. Dozens of people had attended, including descendants of other soldiers who had been helped by Captain Mitchell, historians and researchers inspired by his story, and veterans from more recent conflicts who saw in his example a model for their own service. As Sarah had stood beside the grave, reading the inscription that had been carved into the new headstone, Captain James Mitchell, Union Army, a man of compassion, she had felt a profound sense of completion and peace. The captain's story had been told, his sacrifice honored, and his legacy preserved for future generations. But even as one chapter of the story had been completed, new chapters were beginning. The Foundation's work continued to expand and evolve, taking on new projects and exploring new areas of research. They had begun working with schools to develop curricula that emphasized the human dimension of history, helping students to understand that the past was not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of individual human experiences. They had also begun collaborating with artists and writers, commissioning works that brought these forgotten stories to life in new and creative ways. Playwrights had written dramas based on the accounts they had uncovered, musicians had composed songs inspired by the letters and diaries they had preserved, and painters had created works that captured the emotional essence of the stories they had documented. One of the most ambitious projects was the creation of a virtual reality experience that allowed visitors to walk through a recreation of the Gettysburg battlefield as it appeared during the battle. Using advanced computer graphics and historical research, they had created an immersive environment that allowed people to experience the sights and sounds of the battle while also learning about the individual stories of compassion and heroism that had occurred there. The virtual reality experience had been installed at the Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center and quickly became one of the most popular attractions at the site. Visitors could walk through the recreated battlefield, stopping at various points to hear the stories of individual soldiers, both Union and Confederate, who had shown extraordinary courage and compassion during the battle. The centerpiece of the experience was a recreation of Captain Mitchell's final act of kindness, allowing visitors to witness him risk his life to comfort a wounded enemy soldier. The scene was presented not as a glorification of war, but as a testament to the human capacity for compassion even in the most extreme circumstances. The response to the virtual reality experience had been overwhelmingly positive. Visitors often emerged from the experience with tears in their eyes, deeply moved by the stories they had witnessed. Many had commented that it had changed their understanding of the Civil War, helping them to see it not just as a political and military conflict, but as a human tragedy that had tested the very best and worst of human nature. The success of the Gettysburg installation had led to requests for similar experiences at other historical sites. The Foundation was now working on projects for Antietam, Shiloh, and several other Civil War battlefields, each designed to highlight the individual stories of compassion and heroism that had occurred there. As Sarah looked toward the future, she saw endless possibilities for expanding and deepening the Foundation's work. There were still thousands of stories waiting to be discovered, thousands of voices waiting to be heard. Every archive they explored, every family they contacted, every veteran they interviewed revealed new accounts of human compassion and courage that deserved to be preserved and shared. But perhaps more importantly, she saw the Foundation's work as part of a larger movement toward understanding and reconciliation. In a world that often seemed divided by conflict and hatred, the stories they were preserving offered hope and inspiration. They were proof that even in the darkest of times, the human capacity for goodness and compassion could not be extinguished. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a moment of supernatural intervention, a brief opening of the veil between worlds that had allowed the past to speak directly to the present. But the real magic, the lasting magic, was in the human connections that had been forged as a result of that intervention, the stories that had been told, the healing that had begun. As Sarah stood once again on the battlefield where it all began, watching the sun set over the fields where so many had given their lives for their beliefs, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and a deeper purpose. She had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the veil of time, and she had used that gift to serve something larger than herself. The ghosts of Gettysburg had found their peace, but their stories lived on, carried forward by the living, retold and remembered, and honored. And in that remembrance, in that honoring, there was a kind of immortality, a way for the past to live on in the present, for the dead to speak to the living, for love to triumph over death. The blood moon had set long ago, but its light continued to shine in the Foundation's work, in the stories they preserved, in the connections they forged between past and present. It was a light that would continue to shine as long as there were people who believed in the power of compassion to heal, the importance of memory to preserve, and the magic that exists in the space between what was and what is yet to come. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Gettysburg, Sarah knew that the story was far from over. There were still voices waiting to be heard, still connections waiting to be made, still healing waiting to be done. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been just the beginning of a journey that would continue for as long as people were willing to listen to the whispers of the past and to honor the memory of those who had gone before. In the end, that was what history was really about, not the grand sweep of events or the rise and fall of nations, but the individual human stories that gave meaning to it all. The stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of love persisting in the face of hatred, of hope surviving in the darkest of times. These were the stories that mattered, the stories that healed, the stories that connected us all in the great, ongoing tapestry of human experience. The blood moon over Gettysburg had reminded Sarah of this truth, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life. She would continue to tell the stories, preserve the memories, and honor the past while building a better future. She would be a voice for the voiceless, a light in the darkness, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And somewhere, in the quiet, peaceful fields of Gettysburg, the spirits of the past would continue to smile, knowing that their stories lived on, that their sacrifices had not been forgotten, that their love had found a way to transcend the boundaries of time and death. The blood moon had set, but its light would shine forever in the hearts of those who had witnessed its magic, who had heard its message, and who had felt its power transform them. It was the continuing legacy of the blood moon over Gettysburg, a reminder that we are all connected, all part of a larger whole, all threads in the great tapestry of human experience. And it was a legacy that would continue to grow and spread, touching new lives and inspiring new acts of compassion and understanding, as long as people were willing to listen to the voices of the past and to honor the memory of those who had shown us the way. 10 years had passed since that extraordinary night under the blood moon, and Sarah Mitchell found herself returning once again to the battlefield that had changed her life so profoundly. But this time, she was not alone. Walking beside her was her daughter, Emma, a bright and curious 12-year-old who had grown up hearing the stories of Captain Mitchell and the Foundation's work, but who was experiencing the battlefield for the first time as more than just a place where her mother worked. Emma had her father's eyes. Sarah had married Tommy 3 years after their supernatural encounter, their shared experience having forged a bond that had deepened into love, and her mother's insatiable curiosity about the past. She had been asking questions about the battlefield for weeks, preparing for this visit with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all of Sarah's research. "Tell me again about the night you met Captain Mitchell," Emma said as they walked across the field where Pickett's charge had reached its bloody climax. "Tell me about the blood moon and the ghosts and how everything changed." Sarah smiled, her heart filled with the familiar mixture of wonder and gratitude that always accompanied her memories of that night. She had told this story hundreds of times over the years, to audiences large and small, to scholars and students, to veterans and civilians. But telling it to her own daughter, here on the very ground where it had happened, felt different somehow. More personal, more intimate, more sacred. "It was a night very much like this one," Sarah began, her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. The air was crisp and clear, and there was a sense of anticipation, of something important about to happen. "Your father and I were leading a tour group, just as we had done dozens of times before. But this night was different. This night, the moon was going to turn red, and the veil between the past and the present was going to grow thin." As she spoke, Sarah found herself remembering not just the events of that night, but also the feelings, the emotions, and the profound sense of awe, terror, and wonder that had filled her as she witnessed the impossible. She remembered the way the spectral soldiers had emerged from the mist, the sounds of battle echoing across the field, and Captain Mitchell's appearance before them, solid and real, filled with a sorrow that transcended time. Emma listened with rapt attention, her young imagination painting vivid pictures of the scenes her mother described. She had inherited her parents' sensitivity to the supernatural. As they walked across the battlefield, she could feel the weight of history pressing in around them, the presence of the past that lingered in this sacred place. "Do you think he's still here?" Emma asked as they reached the spot where Captain Mitchell had first appeared to them. "Do you think his spirit is still watching over this place?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Over the years, she had given considerable thought to the nature of what they had experienced that night. She had consulted with theologians and philosophers, as well as physicists and psychologists, seeking to understand the mechanics of what had happened and the forces that had allowed the past to manifest itself so vividly in the present. "I think," she said finally, "that Captain Mitchell found his peace that night. I think his spirit was able to move on, to find the rest that had eluded him for so long. However, I also believe that his story, his example, and his message of compassion and understanding will remain here. It's woven into the very fabric of this place, part of the eternal memory of what happened here." They continued their walk, moving through the areas where Sarah and Tommy had encountered the other spectral soldiers, discovered the surgeon's journal, and witnessed the gradual fading of the spirits as their stories were finally told and acknowledged. Each location held its own memories and significance in the larger narrative that had unfolded over the past decade. The Foundation's work had continued to grow and evolve over the years. They had documented thousands of stories from conflicts around the world, created educational programs that reached millions of students, and established a network of researchers and historians dedicated to preserving the human dimension of history. The virtual reality experiences had been installed at dozens of historical sites, and plans were underway for a permanent museum dedicated to stories of compassion in times of conflict. But perhaps the most significant development had been the establishment of the Mitchell Institute for Compassionate History at Gettysburg College. The institute, funded by donations from around the world, was dedicated to training a new generation of historians in the principles and methods of compassionate history. Students came from universities across the globe to study at the institute, learning not just how to research and document historical events, but also how to find and preserve the individual human stories that gave those events their more profound meaning. Sarah had been appointed as the Institute's first director, a position that allowed her to combine her passion for research with her commitment to education. She taught courses on the methodology of compassionate history and supervised graduate students working on their own projects. She continued researching previously unknown stories of human kindness and courage. Tommy had become the Institute's chief archivist and photographer, responsible for maintaining the vast collection of documents, photographs, and recordings that the Foundation had assembled over the years. His sensitivity to the supernatural had continued to develop, and he had become something of a legend among paranormal researchers for his ability to identify historical sites that might otherwise have been overlooked. But more than that, he had become a master at capturing the emotional essence of historical places and events. His photographs were not just documentary images, they were works of art that conveyed the more profound truths of the human experience of history. His most recent exhibition, Echoes of Compassion, had toured museums across the country, bringing the stories of the Foundation's research to audiences who might never have encountered them otherwise. As Sarah and Emma continued their walk across the battlefield, they encountered other visitors, including families, students, and history enthusiasts who had come to learn about the battle and its significance. Many of them recognized Sarah and approached her to thank her for her work, share their own family stories, or ask questions about the Foundation's research. One older man, walking with a cane and accompanied by his grandson, stopped to speak with them. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, a Korean War veteran who had been deeply moved by the Foundation's work documenting stories of compassion from that conflict. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your Foundation helped me tell my story, the story of a Chinese soldier who saved my life when I was wounded and captured. For 50 years, I carried that story inside me, unsure of how to share it or whether anyone would believe it. But your researchers listened, and they helped me understand that it was important, that it mattered." Sarah felt the familiar warmth that always accompanied these encounters, the knowledge that the Foundation's work was making a real difference in people's lives. "Your story matters," she assured him. "All of these stories matter. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of compassion, of understanding, of human connection." The man's grandson, a boy about Emma's age, listened with wide eyes as his grandfather recounted his experience. It was clear that this was not the first time he had heard the story, but it was equally clear that it had lost none of its power to move and inspire him. As they parted ways, Sarah reflected on the ripple effects of the Foundation's work, how individual stories of compassion could spread outward through families and communities, inspiring new acts of kindness and understanding. It was a reminder that history was not just about the past, it was also about the present and the future, encompassing lessons that could be applied to contemporary challenges. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Emma made their way to the small cemetery where Captain Mitchell was buried. The headstone that had been placed there 5 years earlier had weathered beautifully, its inscription still clear and legible. Fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the stone, a testament to the fact that others continued to visit and remember the captain's story. Emma knelt beside the grave, her small hand tracing the letters of the inscription. "Captain James Mitchell, Union Army, a man of compassion," she read aloud. "Do you think he knows? Do you think he knows about all the good that has come from his story?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her own hand joining Emma's on the weathered stone. "I think he knows," she said softly. "I think he's proud of what we've accomplished, proud that his story has inspired so many others to seek out and preserve similar stories. I think he's at peace, knowing that his message of compassion has found its way into the world." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the cemetery, the peaceful presence of those who had given their lives for their beliefs. It was a moment of reflection and remembrance, a time to honor not just Captain Mitchell, but all of the soldiers, Union and Confederate, who had fought and died at Gettysburg. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Emma asked one final question. "Mom, do you think there will be another blood moon? Do you think the spirits will come back?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Over the years, she had often wondered the same thing. Would there be another supernatural intervention, another moment when the veil between worlds would lift and the past would speak directly to the present? "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I don't think we need another blood moon to continue this work. The spirits have already spoken. They've shared their stories, conveyed their message, and shown us the way forward. Now it's up to us to carry that message into the future, to continue telling their stories, to continue honoring their memory. As they walked back across the battlefield toward their car, the sun beginning to set behind them, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion and continuity. The work that had begun on that extraordinary night 10 years ago would continue, carried forward by new generations of researchers and historians, by students and teachers, by anyone who believed in the power of compassion to heal and transform. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a moment of magic, a brief opening between worlds that had allowed the past to speak to the present. But the real magic, the lasting magic, was in the human connections that had been forged as a result, the stories that had been preserved, the lessons that had been learned. Emma, walking beside her mother as they left the battlefield, was already part of that continuing legacy. She had grown up with these stories, absorbing their lessons about compassion, understanding, and the importance of remembering the past. She would carry those lessons with her as she grew older, and perhaps one day she would continue the work that her parents had begun. As they drove home through the Pennsylvania countryside, the battlefield receding behind them in the gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. It had been a journey of discovery and transformation, of learning to see history not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as a living, breathing tapestry of human experience. The Foundation's work would continue, expanding and evolving as new stories were discovered and new connections were made. The Institute would train new generations of historians in the principles of compassionate history. The virtual reality experiences would bring these stories to life for millions of visitors. The books, articles, and documentaries would continue to spread the message of compassion and understanding to audiences worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, the individual stories themselves would continue to inspire and transform the people who encountered them. Each account of kindness in the midst of conflict, each example of compassion transcending hatred, each demonstration of the fundamental humanity that connects us all, would plant seeds that would grow and flourish in the hearts and minds of those who heard them. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a catalyst, a moment of supernatural intervention that had set in motion a chain of events that continued to unfold. But the real power of that night lay not in the supernatural phenomena that had occurred, but in the very human response to those phenomena, the decision to listen to the voices of the past and to honor their message of compassion and understanding. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed that night, her daughter's head filled with visions of spectral soldiers, blood moons, and acts of extraordinary kindness, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path her life had taken. She had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the veil of time, and she had used that gift to serve something larger than herself. The ghosts of Gettysburg had found their peace, but their stories lived on, carried forward by the living, retold and remembered, and honored. And in that remembrance, in that honoring, there was a kind of immortality, a way for the past to live on in the present, for the dead to speak to the living, for love to triumph over death. The blood moon had set long ago, but its light continued to shine in the Foundation's work, in the stories they preserved, in the connections they forged between past and present. It was a light that would continue to shine as long as there were people who believed in the power of compassion to heal, the importance of memory to preserve, and the magic that exists in the space between what was and what is yet to come. And as Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, she dreamed of Captain Mitchell, not as the sorrowful spirit she had encountered that night 10 years ago, but as he might have been in life, a young man filled with hope and compassion, dedicated to serving something greater than himself, committed to the belief that even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of light. In her dream, he smiled at her, a smile of gratitude and approval, and she knew that the work would continue, that the stories would be told, and that the message of compassion and understanding would find its way into the hearts of future generations. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been just the beginning of a journey that would continue for as long as people were willing to listen to the whispers of the past and to honor the memory of those who had shown them the way. It was the final revelation of the blood moon over Gettysburg, that love is indeed stronger than death, that compassion is more powerful than hatred, and that the stories of the past, when told with an open heart, have the power to heal us all. It was a truth that would endure long after the last witness to that extraordinary night had passed away, a legacy that would continue to inspire and transform the world for generations to come. 20 years had passed since that transformative night under the blood moon, and the world had changed in ways that Sarah Mitchell could never have imagined when she first stood on Cemetery Ridge as a young historian, passionate about the past but unaware of the profound journey that lay ahead of her. The foundation that had grown from that single supernatural encounter had become a global institution, with offices on every continent and researchers working in dozens of languages to preserve and share stories of human compassion from conflicts throughout history. Sarah, now in her 50s, had become one of the most respected historians of her generation, not just for her scholarly achievements, but for her pioneering work in what had come to be known as transformative history, the study of how individual acts of kindness and compassion could ripple outward through time, changing not just the immediate circumstances in which they occurred, but the entire trajectory of human understanding and reconciliation. The Mitchell Institute for Compassionate History had grown from a small program at Gettysburg College into a major research university in its own right, attracting students and faculty from around the world. The campus, built on land adjacent to the battlefield, was designed to reflect the principles of peace and reconciliation that guided the institute's work. The buildings were constructed from local stone, their architecture echoing the simple, dignified style of the Civil War era, while incorporating modern sustainable technologies that demonstrated a commitment to preserving the environment for future generations. The centerpiece of the campus was the Memorial Garden of Compassion, a beautifully landscaped space that honored not just the soldiers of the Civil War, but all those throughout history who had chosen kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, peace over violence. The garden featured pathways that wound through carefully tended beds of native plants and flowers, with small plaques marking spots where visitors could pause to read stories of compassion from conflicts around the world. At the heart of the garden stood a simple granite monument, inscribed with the words that had become the Institute's motto: "In every conflict, in every age, there are those who choose love over fear, compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance. Their stories are our hope, their examples our guide, their legacy our responsibility." Tommy, now the Institute's director of visual archives and still Sarah's husband and closest collaborator, had spent the past 2 decades documenting stories of compassion from every major conflict of the 20th and 21st centuries. His photographic work had evolved far beyond simple documentation. He had developed innovative techniques that combined traditional photography with digital technology to create immersive experiences, allowing viewers to step into historical moments with unprecedented immediacy and emotional impact. His most ambitious project, completed just the previous year, was a comprehensive visual archive of stories from World War II, documenting acts of compassion and humanity that had occurred in concentration camps, on battlefields, in occupied territories, and in prisoner-of-war camps. The project had taken him to dozens of countries, where he had interviewed survivors, visited historical sites, and worked with local historians to uncover stories that had been hidden or forgotten for decades. One of the most potent stories he had documented was that of a German soldier who had risked his life to help Jewish families escape from a ghetto in Poland. The soldier, whose name was Klaus Weber, had been horrified by what he witnessed and had secretly provided food, medicine, and information to resistance fighters working to save lives. He had been discovered by his commanding officers and executed as a traitor, but not before he had helped save the lives of more than 50 people. Tommy had tracked down descendants of both Klaus Weber and the families he had helped, bringing them together for an emotional reunion that was captured in a documentary film viewed by millions of people around the world. The film, titled The Courage to Choose, had won numerous awards and had been translated into more than 30 languages, spreading the message of compassion and moral courage to audiences across the globe. The Institute's research had also expanded beyond military conflicts to include stories of compassion from natural disasters, social upheavals, and other crises throughout history. They had documented accounts of individuals who had risked their own safety to help others during earthquakes, floods, famines, and pandemics. They had collected stories of people who had stood up against injustice during periods of social and political oppression, often at significant personal cost. One particularly moving collection focused on the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2021, documenting the countless acts of kindness and compassion that had occurred during that global crisis. Healthcare workers who had worked tirelessly to save lives, neighbors who had helped elderly residents with shopping and errands, teachers who had gone above and beyond to support their students during remote learning, and ordinary citizens who had found creative ways to maintain human connection and community during periods of isolation and fear. These stories, collected through interviews, social media posts, letters, and other sources, were compiled into a comprehensive archive that served as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion to sustain communities even in the most challenging circumstances. The Institute's educational programs had also evolved and expanded over the years. They now offer degree programs at the undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels, all focused on the study of compassionate history and its applications to contemporary challenges. Students came from around the world to study at the Institute, drawn by its unique approach to historical research and its commitment to using the lessons of the past to build a more compassionate future. The curriculum included not just traditional historical research methods, but also courses in psychology, sociology, conflict resolution, and peace studies. Students learned how to identify and document stories of compassion, analyze the factors that enabled individuals to choose kindness over cruelty, and apply these lessons to contemporary situations. Many graduates of the Institute went on to work in fields such as international diplomacy, humanitarian aid, conflict resolution, and peace education. They carried with them the lessons they had learned about the power of individual action to create positive change, and they applied them in their work around the world. The Institute also established partnerships with organizations such as the United Nations, the International Red Cross, and various peacebuilding organizations, providing research and expertise to support their efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts. The stories and insights gathered by the Institute's researchers have been used to develop training programs for peacekeepers, diplomats, and humanitarian workers, helping them to understand the importance of compassion and empathy in their work. One of the most significant partnerships had been with the International Criminal Court, where the Institute's research had been used to develop new approaches to transitional justice that emphasized healing and reconciliation rather than simply punishment. The stories of compassion that the Institute had documented provided powerful examples of how former enemies could become allies, how communities could heal from the wounds of conflict, and how the cycle of violence could be broken through understanding and forgiveness. Sarah's own work had continued to evolve over the years as well. She had written more than a dozen books, each one exploring different aspects of compassionate history and its implications for understanding human nature and the possibilities for peace. Her most recent work, The Ripple Effect: How Individual Acts of Compassion Change the World, has become an international bestseller and is required reading in universities and peace studies programs worldwide. In the book, Sarah explores the long-term consequences of individual acts of compassion, demonstrating how a single moment of kindness can create ripple effects that last for generations. She used the story of Captain Mitchell as a central example, demonstrating how his final act of compassion had not only saved the life of a young Confederate soldier but had also inspired a movement that touched millions of lives and changed how people thought about history, conflict, and the possibilities for human redemption. The book also included stories from around the world, showing how the principles discovered through the study of Civil War history could be applied to understanding conflicts in other cultures and time periods. Sarah had traveled extensively for her research, visiting sites of historical significance in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, always seeking stories of individuals who had chosen compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance, and peace over violence. One compelling chapter focused on the Rwandan genocide of 1994, documenting stories of Hutus who had risked their lives to save Tutsi neighbors, and of survivors who had later chosen forgiveness over revenge. Sarah had spent months in Rwanda, interviewing survivors and perpetrators, visiting memorial sites, and working with local historians to understand how a society could heal from such profound trauma. The stories she collected were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. She met women who had lost their entire families but who had chosen to adopt the orphaned children of their killers. She interviewed former genocidaires who had undergone profound transformations and were now working to promote reconciliation and peace. She documented the work of community courts that emphasized healing and restoration rather than punishment. She explored the role of traditional Rwandan values, such as Ubuntu, the belief in the fundamental interconnectedness of all human beings, in the country's remarkable recovery. These stories, and others like them from conflicts around the world, demonstrate the universal nature of the principles revealed that night under the blood moon at Gettysburg. Compassion, Sarah had come to understand, was not just a moral virtue, it was a practical necessity for human survival and flourishing. Societies that cultivated compassion and empathy were more resilient, more peaceful, and better able to overcome challenges and conflicts. The Institute's research had also contributed to a growing body of scientific knowledge about the biological and psychological basis of compassion. Working with neuroscientists, psychologists, and evolutionary biologists, the Institute's researchers have helped demonstrate that compassion is not just a cultural construct, but a fundamental aspect of human nature that has evolved over millions of years as a survival mechanism. Studies have shown that acts of compassion trigger the release of hormones such as oxytocin and endorphins, which not only make people feel good but also strengthen social bonds and improve physical health. Communities with higher levels of social cohesion and mutual support were more resilient in the face of challenges, more innovative in solving problems, and more successful in achieving their goals. This scientific research provided a strong foundation for the Institute's educational and advocacy work, demonstrating that compassion was not just morally right but also practical. The stories of individual acts of kindness documented by the Institute were not just inspiring anecdotes, they were evidence of a fundamental truth about human nature and the conditions that allow societies to thrive. As Sarah reflected on the 20 years that had passed since that extraordinary night, she was struck by how a single moment of supernatural intervention had led to such far-reaching and lasting consequences. The appearance of Captain Mitchell's spirit had been brief, lasting only a few hours. Still, its impact had continued to grow and spread, touching the lives of millions and changing the way people thought about history, conflict, and the possibilities for human redemption. The foundation and institute that had grown from that encounter had become more than just academic institutions. They had become symbols of hope and possibility, demonstrations that even the darkest chapters of human history contained lessons that could guide humanity toward a more compassionate and peaceful future. The virtual reality experiences developed based on the Institute's research were now installed at historical sites around the world, allowing millions of visitors each year to experience stories of compassion and courage in immersive, emotionally powerful ways. The educational programs had trained thousands of teachers, diplomats, humanitarian workers, and peace activists, all of whom carried the Institute's message of compassion into their work worldwide. The books, articles, documentaries, and other publications produced by the Institute's researchers had been translated into dozens of languages and had reached audiences on every continent. The stories they contained had inspired countless individuals to examine their own lives and choices, to seek out opportunities to show kindness and compassion, and to work toward building more peaceful and just communities. But perhaps most importantly, the Institute's work had helped to change the way that people thought about history itself. No longer was history seen as simply a record of wars and politics, of the rise and fall of empires and the actions of great leaders. Instead, history was understood as a tapestry of individual human experiences, a collection of stories that revealed the full range of human nature and the choices individuals made in moments of crisis and challenge. This new understanding of history had profound implications for education, policymaking, and the way societies dealt with conflict and trauma. Instead of focusing solely on the causes and consequences of wars and other conflicts, historians and educators began to pay equal attention to the stories of individuals who chose compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance, and peace over violence. These stories provided models and inspiration for contemporary challenges, demonstrating that even in the most difficult circumstances, individuals could make choices that led to positive change. They demonstrated that ordinary people, not just great leaders and famous figures, could shape the course of history through their actions and decisions. The Institute's work also contributed to a growing movement toward restorative justice and conflict resolution, emphasizing healing and reconciliation rather than punishment and revenge. The stories of compassion that the Institute had documented provided powerful examples of how former enemies could become allies, how communities could heal from the wounds of conflict, and how the cycle of violence could be broken through understanding and forgiveness. This approach had been applied to conflicts around the world, from post-apartheid South Africa to post-conflict Northern Ireland, from the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda to the ongoing efforts to build peace in the Middle East. In each case, lessons from historical examples of compassion and reconciliation have provided valuable insights and guidance for contemporary peacebuilding efforts. As Sarah stood once again on the battlefield where it all began, now accompanied not just by her daughter Emma, who had grown into a young woman and was studying at the Institute herself, but also by her granddaughter, 5-year-old Grace, she felt a profound sense of continuity and hope. The work that had begun on that extraordinary night 20 years ago would continue, carried forward by new generations of researchers and educators, by students and teachers, by anyone who believed in the power of compassion to heal and transform. Grace, with the innocent curiosity of childhood, asked the same questions that Emma had asked years before, and that countless other children had asked during visits to the battlefield. "Grandma Sarah, tell me about the ghosts. Tell me about the blood moon. Tell me about Captain Mitchell." And Sarah, her voice filled with the same wonder and gratitude that had characterized her telling of this story for 2 decades, began once again to recount the events of that extraordinary night. But now, the story had grown and evolved, encompassing not just the supernatural encounter that had started it all, but the entire movement that had emerged from it. These lives had been changed, the communities had been healed, and the conflicts had been resolved through the application of lessons learned from studying historical examples of compassion and courage. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been a moment of magic, a brief opening between worlds that had allowed the past to speak to the present. But the real magic, the lasting magic, was in the human connections that had been forged as a result, the stories that had been preserved, the lessons that had been learned, and the hope that had been kindled in the hearts of millions of people around the world. As the sun set over the battlefield, painting the sky in the same brilliant shades of orange and purple that had preceded the eclipse 20 years before, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace and completion. The ghosts of Gettysburg had found their rest, but their stories lived on, carried forward by the living, told and retold, remembered and honored. The blood moon had set long ago, but its light continued to shine in the Institute's work, in the stories they preserved, in the connections they forged between past and present, and in the hope they offered for a more compassionate and peaceful future. It was a light that would continue to shine as long as there were people who believed in the power of love to overcome hatred, of understanding to triumph over ignorance, of compassion to heal the wounds of the world. And in that light, the past and the present would continue to intertwine, creating new stories, new connections, and new possibilities for healing and hope. The blood moon over Gettysburg had been just the beginning of a journey that would continue for as long as people were willing to listen to the whispers of the past and to honor the memory of those who had shown them the way toward a better, more compassionate world. It was the eternal echo of that extraordinary night, a reminder that we are all connected, all part of a larger whole, all threads in the great tapestry of human experience. And it was an echo that would continue to resonate through the ages, inspiring new generations to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance, peace over violence, love over fear. The story of the blood moon over Gettysburg would never truly end, because it was not just a story about the past, it was a story about the eternal human capacity for goodness, for growth, for redemption. It was a story that would continue to be told as long as there were people who believed in the power of individual actions to create positive change, who understood that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward through time, touching lives and changing hearts across the generations. And so the legacy lived on, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark and divided, a reminder that even in the most challenging times, there was always the possibility of light, of healing, of love triumphant over all. As we reach the end of this extraordinary tale, it is essential to understand that this is not truly an ending at all, but rather a beginning. The beginning of your own journey into the more profound mysteries of human compassion and the eternal connections that bind us all across the vast expanse of time and space. The story of the blood moon over Gettysburg reminds us that history is not a distant, abstract concept, but a living, breathing presence that surrounds us every day. The past is not gone, it lives on in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, the choices we make, and the love we share. Every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every choice to show compassion rather than cruelty creates ripples that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances, touching lives and changing hearts in ways we may never fully comprehend. Sarah Mitchell's journey from a conventional historian to a pioneer of compassionate history illustrates the transformative power of being open to the impossible, of listening to the whispers of the past, and of allowing ourselves to be changed by the stories we encounter. Her willingness to believe in something beyond the rational, beyond the documented, beyond the provable, opened doorways to understanding that had been closed for generations. Tommy Brennan's evolution from a local photographer with paranormal interests to a master chronicler of human compassion exemplifies how our unique gifts and sensitivities, when directed towards serving others, can become powerful tools for healing and understanding. His ability to see beyond the veil, to capture the essence of places where profound human dramas had unfolded, became a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, between the documented and the felt, between the known and the mysterious. Captain James Mitchell himself represents the eternal truth that individual acts of compassion, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, have the power to transcend death itself. His final act of kindness to a wounded enemy soldier created ripples that continued to spread for more than a century and a half, ultimately inspiring a global movement dedicated to preserving and honoring similar stories of human goodness. The Confederate surgeon, Dr. Alastair Finch, whose journal provided crucial validation of Captain Mitchell's story, reminds us that witnesses to compassion play a vital role in the great tapestry of human experience. Sometimes we are called to be the ones who show kindness, sometimes we are called to be the ones who record and remember that kindness, ensuring that it is not lost to the passage of time. William Whitmore, the young Confederate soldier whose life was touched by Captain Mitchell's compassion, represents all those whose lives are changed by encounters with unexpected kindness. His decision to honor that kindness throughout his long life, and to pass the story down through his family, demonstrates how the recipients of compassion become its carriers, ensuring that its influence continues to spread through the generations. The blood moon itself serves as a powerful symbol of transformation and revelation. Just as the Earth's shadow dramatically alters the moon's appearance, so too can our understanding of history, human nature, and our own potential for goodness be transformed when we allow ourselves to see familiar things in new ways. The crimson light that bathed the battlefield that night was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a metaphor for how love and compassion can illuminate even the darkest chapters of human experience, revealing hidden truths and unexpected possibilities for healing and redemption. The foundation and institute that grew from that single supernatural encounter demonstrate how individual inspiration, when combined with dedicated effort and collaborative vision, can create institutions that outlast their founders and continue to serve humanity for generations. The work of preserving and sharing stories of compassion has become a living legacy, a testament to the power of human beings to learn from the past and to use those lessons to build a better future. The global network of researchers, educators, and peace builders who this work has inspired represents the infinite potential for good that exists when people come together around shared values of compassion, understanding, and hope. Each person who these stories have touched becomes a carrier of their message, spreading the influence of compassion ever wider through their own actions and choices. The educational programs, virtual reality experiences, books, documentaries, and other resources that have emerged from this work demonstrate how the tools of modern technology and communication can amplify and extend the reach of ancient wisdom about human nature and the conditions that allow societies to flourish. The marriage of cutting-edge innovation with timeless truths about compassion and understanding creates powerful new possibilities for education, healing, and transformation. The scientific research that has validated the biological and psychological basis of compassion provides a strong foundation for the practical application of these insights to contemporary challenges. Understanding that compassion is not just a moral ideal but also a practical necessity for human survival and flourishing gives us confidence that efforts to promote empathy and understanding are not naive idealism but realistic strategies for building more resilient and prosperous communities. The partnerships with international organizations, governments, and peacebuilding institutions demonstrate how academic research and historical understanding can be translated into practical action that makes a real difference in the world. The stories of compassion that have been preserved and studied are not just interesting historical artifacts, they are blueprints for contemporary peacebuilding, conflict resolution, and social healing. The continuing evolution and expansion of this work, from its origins in Civil War history to its current global scope encompassing conflicts and crises throughout human history, illustrate the universal nature of the principles first revealed on that extraordinary night. Compassion, courage, and the choice to see the humanity in our enemies are not limited to any particular culture, time period, or type of conflict. They are fundamental aspects of human nature that can be cultivated and strengthened through understanding and practice. The personal transformations experienced by Sarah, Tommy, and countless others involved in this work remind us that studying and sharing stories of compassion is not just an intellectual exercise but a profoundly personal journey of growth and discovery. When we open our hearts to others' experiences and allow ourselves to be moved by stories of courage and kindness, we, too, are changed in the process. The intergenerational aspect of this story, from Captain Mitchell to Sarah to Emma to Grace, illustrates how the influence of compassion extends across time, creating connections between past, present, and future that transcend the boundaries of individual lifetimes. Each generation has the opportunity to receive the gifts of wisdom and understanding from those who came before, and the responsibility to pass those gifts on to those who will come after. The ripple effects that continue to spread from that single night under the blood moon demonstrate the infinite potential that exists in every moment, in every choice, in every act of kindness or compassion. We never know how far our actions will reach, how many lives they will touch, how much healing they will create. The story of Captain Mitchell reminds us that even our smallest gestures of goodness can have consequences that extend far beyond our imagination. As you finish reading this story, you become part of its continuing legacy. The knowledge you have gained, the emotions you have felt, and the insights you have received all become part of you, influencing your own choices and actions in ways both large and small. You carry within you now the stories of all these individuals who chose compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance, love over fear. The question that remains is what you will do with these stories, how you will allow them to influence your own life and relationships, how you will contribute to the continuing circle of compassion that began on that extraordinary night and continues to expand with each person who hears and embraces its message. Perhaps you will be inspired to research your own family history, to uncover stories of courage and kindness that have been forgotten or overlooked. Perhaps you will look for opportunities in your own life to show unexpected compassion to those who might be considered enemies or strangers. Perhaps you will work to promote understanding and reconciliation in your own community, drawing on the lessons learned from these historical examples. Or perhaps you will carry these stories in your heart, allowing them to influence the countless small choices you make each day about how to treat others, how to respond to conflict, how to contribute to the healing of a world that often seems broken and divided. Whatever form your response takes, you are now part of the eternal echo of that blood moon over Gettysburg, part of the infinite circle of compassion that connects all human beings across time and space. The ghosts of the past have spoken, their message has been heard, and now it is up to each of us to ensure that their legacy of love and understanding continues to shine its light into the future. In the end, this is what the blood moon over Gettysburg teaches us, that we are all connected, all part of a larger story, all capable of choosing love over fear, compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance. The past is not gone, it lives on in us. The future is not predetermined, it will be shaped by the choices we make today. And in every moment, in every decision we face, we have the opportunity to add our own thread to the great tapestry of human compassion that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. The blood moon has set, but its light shines on forever in the hearts of all who have been touched by its magic, who have heard its message, who have chosen to carry its legacy forward into the world. It is our gift, our responsibility, and our hope, to be bearers of compassion, tellers of stories, builders of bridges between past and present, between enemy and friend, between what was and what yet might be. The story continues, and you are now part of it. The circle is complete, and yet it is also just beginning. The blood moon over Gettysburg was not an ending but a beginning, not a conclusion but an invitation, not a final answer but an eternal question. What will you do with the gift of compassion that has been placed in your hands? The answer to that question will determine not just your own story, but the story of all humanity, as we continue our long journey toward understanding, toward healing, toward the light that shines beyond all darkness, toward the love that conquers all fear, toward the compassion that makes us truly human. It is the eternal echo of the blood moon over Gettysburg. It will continue to resonate through the ages, calling each of us to choose love, to show kindness, to build bridges, to heal wounds, and to add our own voice to the great chorus of human compassion that began in the mists of time and will continue until the end of days. And so we close this chapter of an eternal story, knowing that somewhere, in the quiet fields of Gettysburg, in the hearts of those who remember, in the actions of those who choose compassion over hatred, the light of that blood moon continues to shine, illuminating the path toward a more understanding, more compassionate, more hopeful world for all humanity. The story lives on, the circle continues, and the echo of that extraordinary night will resonate through eternity, calling each of us to be better, to do better, to love more deeply, and never to forget that in every moment of darkness, there is always the possibility of light, always the choice of compassion, always the hope of redemption, always the promise that love, in the end, will triumph over all. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story. And prepare yourself. For there are many more echoes to be heard, many more mysteries to be solved, and a great, glorious future to be won. The age of humanity is dawning. And it will be an age of wonders. Please subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.